The moment the investigators walked in with handcuffs, I knew the night was about to implode in a way none of us could walk back from. Their arrival wasn't loud, but it cut straight through the celebration, clean, sharp, undeniable. And before anyone understood who they were here for, my stomach had already locked into a knot I couldn't name. My name is Nora Mitchell, and I never expected the first shock of the evening to land on me as hard as it did. I had walked into that ballroom prepared for tension, yes, but not for the exact flavor of dread waiting beneath it. Something was off the second I stepped inside. The energy felt coiled, tight, as if the room itself had been holding its breath long before I arrived. I wasn't supposed to be the center of anything tonight, yet every instinct in me whispered that a storm had been building quietly, and I had somehow stepped right into the eye of it. It hit me then, a recognition I couldn't shake. Someone had set the stage for a reveal, and whatever they believed they were about to expose, they expected me to break under it. They were certain I wouldn't see it coming. They were wrong, because the moment those investigators crossed the threshold, everything shifted. The plan someone had so carefully crafted began to unravel right in front of all of us. And I realized, with a clarity that almost scared me, that the truth about to surface wasn't the truth they thought they'd paid for. What happened next didn't just change the night. It changed the entire story they believed they controlled. Before I take you into the moment everything flipped, tell me this. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I always love seeing how far a single story can travel. A quiet shift in memory always finds its way back to me when I try to understand how everything fractured. So I let it guide me to the years when the imbalance first began to settle inside our home. I grew up watching expectations form clear lines around each of us, and even when I pretended not to notice, the weight of those lines changed how I moved through the world. My sister, Sydney Mitchell, stepped into every room as if it were already shaped for her, and the rest of us reacted accordingly. My father treated her accomplishments as proof that she was built for leadership, while my mother praised her composure and reliability. I stood beside them, capable in my own ways, yet always slotted into the unspoken category of someone who needed direction more than autonomy. I learned early that being good with technology didn't impress anyone at home. My father believed real success involved structure and predictability, things he recognized and valued. My mother approached me with gentle concern, insisting she only wanted to help me find solid footing. Both of them meant well, but their vision for me never aligned with the work I loved, the kind that kept me awake experimenting on projects no one had asked for. Whenever I showed them something I built, the reaction stayed the same. A polite nod, a subtle suggestion that I should consider something more stable, something closer to what Sydney did. Sydney thrived under their admiration. She planned events, led committees, earned praise at every turn. I didn't resent her for it, but I couldn't ignore how naturally she filled the space our parents cleared for her. When she launched a community initiative during college, the entire family celebrated as if she had already transformed the world. I, on the other hand, spent that same year in my dorm room learning how to harden small networks against intrusion attempts, a skill that fascinated me but drew no interest at home. Their silence never stopped me, but it created distance I didn't yet know how to name. Years passed like that, steady and predictable, until the night that finally snapped the pattern. It was meant to be a simple dinner, a gathering my mother described as a chance to reconnect before we all got too busy again. I walked in expecting nothing more than polite conversation, but the tone shifted the moment my father asked about my long-term goals. He wasn't unkind, yet the question carried the familiar assumption that I lacked direction. My mother followed with a gentle remark about stability, and right on cue, Sydney offered a solution she believed would help both of us. She suggested I join her community foundation part-time, a role she insisted would provide structure while giving me a sense of purpose. The table fell into a comfortable silence, waiting for me to be grateful. It wasn't malicious. It was habitual, a routine built over years of assigning value to one path and overlooking another. Still, something inside me tightened. I felt the same pressure I had felt my entire life, but on that night it pushed differently. Not into resignation, but clarity. I realized then that if I accepted her offer, I would spend the rest of my life orbiting someone else's version of me. So I pushed my chair back with a calm I didn't entirely understand, stood, and refused the script they expected. There was no anger in me. There was recognition. I couldn't become who I wanted to be if I kept letting them decide what counted as real achievement. Leaving that table marked more than a disagreement. It became the quiet border between the daughter they believed they understood and the woman I was determined to become. I didn't announce my intentions or defend my choices. I simply walked away and let the air settle behind me, knowing the shift would ripple through all of us eventually. I didn't imagine how far it would reach, only that it needed to happen. I built my future from that moment forward, but I never forgot the silence at that table or the way it taught me to trust what I saw, even when no one else did. Years later, tension returned in a form I could not ignore. My company had grown into something real by then, with a small team, steady contracts, and enough responsibility to fill every hour I gave it. My days were built around incident reports, security reviews, and meetings that actually led somewhere. I no longer needed anyone at home to understand what I did. The work validated itself, and distance from my family had become part of that stability. One morning, that distance thinned. I was working through a list of client updates when my phone vibrated with several notifications in quick succession. The name on the screen snapped my focus more effectively than any alert from our systems. It was my cousin, Dylan Cross, who understood money and regulations far better than family moods and rarely contacted me without a concrete reason. His messages were short and careful, the way people write when they know screenshots could travel. He had noticed activity tied to my last name and to a charitable foundation connected to my family, and the details bothered him enough to reach out in the middle of the day. He did not spell out everything, but the shape of what he implied was clear. Information about me had been pulled, checked, and cross-checked, and the process had drifted into areas controlled by someone I knew too well. I set the phone down and let the implications settle. I had stayed out of foundation business on purpose, avoiding its events and keeping my company separate from anything tied to it. If someone was using that world as a doorway into mine, they were doing it deliberately. This was not casual curiosity. It was targeted scrutiny. By noon, I had forwarded a summary of Dylan's warning to my Chief Operating Officer, Shane Parker, and asked him to stop by. Shane approached every irregularity like a potential breach, even when it involved people rather than code. When he entered my office, he carried a folder thick enough to explain why his reply had been immediate. He placed it on my desk and waited. Inside, I found a structured record of my professional life: contract histories, corporate filings, licensing documents, credit checks that stayed within legal bounds yet pressed against their edges. Each page carried markings that suggested a formal investigation rather than idle research. Individually, nothing in the file alarmed me. I had built the company deliberately, with legal oversight and more caution than ambition some days. What unsettled me was the context implied by the notes in the margins and the pattern of the requests. The origin of the inquiry did not point toward a regulator performing standard due diligence. It connected back to accounts associated with the foundation run by my sister. My name appeared at the top of the file, but the arrows drawn through the pages led somewhere else. The more I read, the more obvious it became that I was not the conclusion of this process. I was the entry point. Someone had paid specialists to confirm whether my company was real, hoping to find a gap big enough to turn into a scandal. Instead, Those specialists had documented something different and had followed that trail with the same thoroughness they had been hired to direct at me. The timing bothered me almost as much as the content. A family event was approaching, one that would gather relatives who had not been in the same room for years. Placed beside this file, it looked less like a simple celebration and more like a stage waiting for a script. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the instinctive bracing for a performance built at my expense. For a moment, I pictured walking into that room unaware, surrounded by a narrative designed to prove I was pretending. The thought passed as quickly as it formed. Whatever story someone was arranging around my name, I had seen enough to recognize its shape. I was not the one whose choices were truly under threat. The conflict ahead no longer looked like a test of whether I deserved what I had built. It looked like a collision between the truth I lived by and the version of reality someone else needed to protect. A shift in routine the following week signaled that the situation was moving faster than I anticipated. My inbox filled with notifications from regulators, not addressed to me personally, but copied to my company as part of routine correspondence. Nothing in the messages implicated my work, yet the timing felt connected to the file Shane had shown me. It was clear that whatever trail began with those inquiries had continued beyond the walls of my office. I kept working, but the background noise of uncertainty settled into every task. Even small decisions took on a sharper edge, as if the ground beneath them might tilt. I knew my name had been examined, but someone else's choices were now creating the turbulence pushing through the cracks. That recognition did not frighten me. It reminded me to stay alert. When an email arrived requesting a scheduled call with a representative from the state's financial crimes unit, I accepted. The name attached belonged to Monica Reeves, someone I had only heard about in passing through industry circles. She was known for approaching investigations with a clarity that cut through speculation and focused on verifiable facts. Her involvement confirmed that the matter had moved beyond private inquiry. The conversation stayed strictly procedural. She outlined the scope of what her unit was reviewing, and though she never referenced my sister by name, the direction of her questions told me the investigation had entered a formal phase. She made clear that my company was not under scrutiny, and that the information collected about me served only as context for a larger assessment. The details she chose not to elaborate on carried more weight than the ones she did. When the call ended, I sensed that a line I had avoided for years had been crossed without my participation. The thought stayed with me long after I returned to my tasks. I had spent so much time trying to keep my world separate from the one I grew up in, believing distance could shield me from their expectations and from the patterns I refused to repeat. Yet here I was, watching those patterns loop back in a form none of us had predicted. I wasn't the one who initiated the sequence, but I was positioned close enough to feel its reach. Later that week, I received a message from my grandfather, Albert Mitchell, asking if I had time to stop by. He rarely contacted me directly, and when he did, it was usually for something simple. This felt different. I drove to his house with the quiet understanding that whatever he wanted to discuss would tie into the current unraveling, whether he said so openly or not. He met me with the steadiness he had always reserved for moments that required patience. As we talked, he mentioned decisions he had made months earlier. Decisions meant to clarify operations within the foundation. He had authorized an independent audit before any of us knew what Sydney planned or what investigators might uncover. He never framed his actions as suspicion. He described them as a safeguard. Still, the timing told its own story. He had sensed something faltering and chose to address it before it could spread. Listening to him brought back the same quiet recognition I had felt the night I walked away from that dinner table years ago. I realized he wasn't asking me to solve anything or defend myself. He simply wanted me to know he had taken steps to protect what he could. Not because he doubted me, but because he valued transparency over appearance. His steady certainty reminded me that integrity often moves quietly, without witnesses or applause. When I left his home, the truth settled with more clarity than before. Whatever narrative someone intended to build around me would collide with the facts they had overlooked. I saw the path unfolding, not in dramatic turns, but in a series of inevitable consequences set into motion long before I became aware of them. I had no desire to escalate anything, but I also knew I could not avoid the next steps. I returned to my office with a sense of finality I had not felt in years. The separation I once clung to no longer applied. The situation had crossed into territory where presence mattered more than distance. My absence would no longer protect me. It would only allow someone else's version of events to grow unchecked. I understood then that I could not step aside from what was coming. My role was no longer optional. The night of the event arrived with an uneasiness that felt strangely deliberate, as if the gathering itself had been arranged to magnify whatever was already waiting beneath the surface. I stepped inside knowing I had no control over the momentum already in motion, yet the decision to be present felt necessary. Avoidance had carried me as far as it could, and standing in that room became its own quiet declaration. Family members moved through conversations shaped more by routine than interest, each person slipping into familiar roles. I noticed how quickly patterns reemerged when we gathered, how even the smallest gestures hinted at expectations none of us had acknowledged openly. My parents greeted me with polite warmth, the kind reserved for occasions rather than genuine closeness, while my sister navigated the space with confidence sharpened for performance. She carried herself as if the evening existed for her benefit, and the certainty in her posture made it clear she believed she controlled the narrative. As people took their seats, I recognized the rhythm of an event designed to impress. The atmosphere tightened around the anticipation of speeches, acknowledgments, and the subtle hierarchy of who was meant to shine. I knew Sydney planned to take advantage of that stage, shaping her words into something that would appear generous until the moment she redirected them. Her timing had always been precise, and the structure of these gatherings played naturally into her ability to command attention. I waited, not for her performance, but for the point at which reality would meet the version of the truth she hoped to present. My grandfather, Albert, sat near the front with the calm presence of someone who had weathered more storms than the room could imagine. His steady composure strengthened my resolve, not by offering reassurance, but by grounding me in the understanding that the foundation of our family had once been sturdier. The responsibility for its cracks now rested elsewhere. When the room quieted, Sydney stepped forward, microphone in hand. She opened her remarks with praise for our grandfather, choosing phrases that highlighted her connection to him while implicitly framing herself as the family's moral compass. Each sentence flowed easily, shaped for admiration. I listened without reacting, recognizing the moment she shifted her tone, subtle at first, then intentional. Her focus began to narrow, her confidence growing with the attention she drew from the crowd. She pivoted toward broader themes about honesty, responsibility, and what she called the importance of transparency within families. The implication threaded through her words with calculated restraint, inching closer to the target she intended. Conversations stilled, heads turned, the balance of the room tilted toward expectation, and I felt the collective inhale of relatives preparing for something more pointed. She continued with the certainty of someone convinced she had uncovered a weakness worth exposing. Her posture sharpened, and her expression hinted at satisfaction she believed she had earned. I recognized the moment she prepared to direct the room's scrutiny toward me, the beat of silence she allowed before making her claim. She lifted her chin slightly, ready to present her discovery with self-assured authority. Before she could continue, the doors opened with a decisive clarity that cut through her momentum. 3 individuals entered, moving with the composed purpose of people accustomed to formal procedures. At their center was Monica Reeves, identifiable not by introduction, but by the controlled confidence she carried. The room shifted instantly, its attention redirected without resistance. Their presence altered the air in a way no speech could. Monica addressed the gathering with concise professionalism, explaining that they were there to speak with Sydney regarding matters tied to charitable oversight. She never raised her voice, yet every word carried undeniable authority. Confusion rippled through the crowd, breaking the polished surface Sydney had worked so hard to maintain. Sydney attempted to recover her stance, but the certainty she relied on faltered. The investigators' request for her cooperation left no room for interpretation. The foundation she led was now part of a formal inquiry, and the steps being taken were procedural rather than optional. She protested, not with reason but with instinct, reacting to the sudden loss of narrative control. Her composure unraveled, revealing the fear she had tried to bury beneath confidence. Monica remained unmoved, guiding the process with steady precision. When the agents proceeded with their next steps, the room fell into absolute stillness. The reaction from the guests hovered between disbelief and discomfort, a collective realization that the story unfolding before them bore no resemblance to the version Sydney had prepared. I watched from my place without stepping forward, letting the truth stand on its own. I felt no satisfaction in her unraveling, only a quiet acknowledgement that consequences had finally reached the person who initiated this chain of events. The evening no longer belonged to the performance Sydney intended. It belonged to the facts she had tried to outrun, and the room was witnessing them in real time. The days following the event moved with a strange heaviness, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the fallout settling around us. Information traveled quickly, even among people who preferred not to acknowledge conflict. Within a week, updates about the investigation reached relatives who had barely spoken to one another in years. Predictable anxieties followed, accompanied by attempts to rewrite their proximity to the situation. Some insisted they had sensed something amiss for months. Others distanced themselves entirely, claiming they had never been deeply involved in the Foundation's work. The shifting narratives revealed more about them than about the circumstances they were trying to interpret. My sister's world changed abruptly. The inquiry into the Foundation expanded, drawing attention from regulatory agencies and financial professionals who approached their work without sentiment. Reports surfaced outlining discrepancies in allocations, patterns of spending inconsistent with stated goals, and a chain of decisions that suggested more than carelessness. None of it surprised me after what I had seen, yet the reality of it still carried weight. Sydney faced a process that moved slowly, measured by procedures rather than emotion. Each step created new consequences, none of which could be managed through charm or influence. My parents responded in ways that reflected their long-standing roles. My mother's concern shifted into quiet panic, expressed through attempts to shield Sydney from judgment, even when she did not fully understand what had occurred. My father approached the situation with a rigidity he mistook for strength, attempting to control a narrative that had already slipped beyond the reach of family discussion. Neither of them directed blame at me outright, but the subtle tension in their presence revealed discomfort they could not disguise. I carried no anger toward them, only a recognition that they were confronting a version of their family they had never prepared themselves to see. As for me, the aftermath brought a clarity I had not expected. My work continued uninterrupted, yet something within my perspective shifted. The boundary I once maintained between my professional life and my family had never been impermeable. It had merely held long enough for me to become someone who could stand independently when it finally gave way. Knowing that the investigation had not originated from my actions, but had instead drawn strength from the truth uncovered through someone else's choices, brought a kind of grounding I had never experienced. I learned that integrity is not loud but steady, and its consequences extend far beyond the moment they become visible. The findings eventually resulted in a negotiated outcome for Sydney. She accepted oversight from the state, financial restitution, and restrictions that prevented her from holding fiduciary authority for several years. It was not a dramatic downfall, but a structured consequence designed to rebuild accountability from the ground up. Friends who once celebrated her success grew distant, unsure how to navigate the shift in status. The foundation dissolved, leaving behind only records and the lessons drawn from them. For the first time, my sister faced a world that required her to stand without the validation that had shaped her for so long. During this period, my grandfather remained a steady presence. His health had grown more fragile, yet his clarity had not faded. When I visited him, he spoke with a calm that cut through the noise surrounding our family. He never assigned blame or offered simplistic comfort. Instead, he emphasized the importance of rebuilding trust through consistent truth rather than grand gestures. His perspective reminded me that consequences, while painful, can create opportunities for growth when approached with humility. I carried his words into decisions I made in the months that followed. With the foundation no longer operating, the building associated with it became available for purchase. I acquired it quietly, completing the transfer with little ceremony. Rather than preserving what it had represented before, I transformed it into a center dedicated to digital safety for young people. A space designed to help others protect their own futures, especially those who lacked guidance. Watching students learn skills I had once developed alone gave the building a renewed purpose, one grounded in integrity rather than image. As the investigation faded from headlines and relatives moved on to other concerns, I remained aware of how deeply the events had reshaped us. The impact lingered not in public records, but in the private understanding that each of us now carried. The truth had surfaced, and nothing about our family dynamics could return to their previous shape. I accepted that change with steadiness, knowing there was still more to navigate before anything resembled closure. A quiet shift began months after the investigation concluded. Subtle at first, then steady enough that I could no longer ignore it. It started with the way my days felt different, not lighter or easier, but clearer. The distance I had once built to protect myself no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a boundary shaped by understanding rather than fear. My work remained demanding, yet it carried a new steadiness because I no longer measured myself through the lens my family once held. I had stepped out of that frame, and staying outside it finally felt natural. The changes within my family moved more slowly. My mother tried to resume traditions, attempting to gather us the way she had before, though the tone had shifted. She no longer spoke with unquestioning confidence about my sister's decisions, and she approached me with a caution that suggested she was learning how to see me differently. My father adjusted with more difficulty. He maintained his quiet pride in the image our family once projected, yet the events surrounding the foundation had forced him to acknowledge that image was never as solid as he believed. His attempts to rebuild closeness came in small efforts rather than grand gestures, and I recognized them as steps he was still learning to take. My sister Sydney changed in ways no one expected. The structure of her consequence required her to attend counseling sessions, complete hours of community service, and participate in financial education programs designed to prevent future misuse of funds. The transformation was not dramatic, but gradual, the kind born from forced self-reflection. She reduced her presence online, stopped curating her life for approval, and withdrew from circles that had once fueled her sense of superiority. For a long time, she remained distant, unsure how to approach me without the armor she used to rely on. Her message arrived unexpectedly one morning. It was short, careful, and free of excuses. She asked if we could meet when her restrictions ended, adding only that she hoped to speak honestly. I did not respond immediately. I needed time to consider what reconciliation meant after years of imbalance. Eventually, I agreed. Not out of obligation, but because I sensed the request came from a place she had never reached before. We met at a small cafe, one neither of us had visited during our childhood or our adult lives. The unfamiliar setting made the conversation possible. She arrived without her usual composure, carrying a vulnerability that made her appear younger than I remembered. She spoke openly about the pressure she had placed on herself to maintain a perfect image, the jealousy she felt watching me build something without seeking approval, and the fear that admitting her mistakes would destroy whatever identity she had built. She never asked me to absolve her. Instead, she acknowledged the harm she caused and the unfairness she allowed to shape our relationship. Listening to her did not erase the past, but it softened its weight. I realized that healing did not require us to return to what we once were. It required us to become something new, shaped not by competition or expectation, but by honesty. I shared my own perspective, not to justify my distance, but to explain why it had been necessary. She received my words without defensiveness, a change that felt more significant than any formal consequence she had faced. Over time, we rebuilt a version of connection that did not rely on the roles we once played. We met occasionally for coffee, exchanged updates without performance, and learned how to regard each other without the silent rivalry that had shaped our early years. My parents adapted as well, finding comfort in the quieter, steadier version of family we were learning to create. My grandfather remained the anchor through it all, watching the gradual healing with a patience that matched the quiet strength he had always carried. In the center I had built, young students continued to learn skills that could protect their futures. Their determination reminded me why I had chosen to transform the old foundation building rather than let it sit in memory. It became a symbol of what could be rebuilt after something collapsed, not through denial, but through purpose. As I moved forward, I understood that the past no longer defined me. It informed me, shaped me, but no longer confined me. Healing had not arrived all at once. It came through choices made deliberately, quietly, and consistently, until the story that once belonged to fear finally became one rooted in clarity. Thank you for listening to her story. This story became less about exposure and more about transformation. It showed that accountability can break a family or rebuild it, depending on what they choose afterward. If you were in Nora's place, would you forgive as she did, or keep your distance permanently? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective matters.